Welcome to the selfgrowth.com show. My name is David Riklan, and I'm the founder of selfgrowth.com. Today, we'll be discussing the future leader, 9 skills and mindsets to succeed in the next decade and beyond. To help us understand this topic, I'm excited to interview Jacob Morgan. Make sure to listen closely. We're going to be sharing a lot of information today. Before we get started, I just want to take a couple of minutes and share some information about Jacob. Jacob Morgan is a 4-time best-selling author, keynote speaker, and futurist who explores leadership, employee experience, and the future of work. He's also the founder of futureofworkuniversity.com, an online education and training platform that helps future-proof individuals and organizations by teaching them the skills they need to succeed in the future of work. His work has been endorsed by the CEOs of multiple companies, including Unilever, MasterCard, Cisco, T-Mobile, Best Buy, SAP, Nestle, KPMG, Schneider Electric, many, many others. And I just want everybody to take down a website for the future, and we'll talk a little bit about it. It's a free leadership assessment that Jacob's offering for anybody listening. And the website is futureleadersurvey.com. futureleadersurvey.com. So just jot that down for later. It's a free assessment for you. At this point, we're ready to jump in. Jacob, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, very excited. We've got a lot of good information to share today. So I'm going to jump right in. We're going to be talking about your book today. And the book is The Future Leader, 9 Skills and Mindsets to Succeed in the Next Decade and Beyond. So let's start. Why did you write the book, and how did you end up getting involved in this whole area?
Yeah, sure. So I got involved with all this because I always had terrible jobs working for other people. Like many people, I always thought that I would ascend the corporate ranks of an organization and go get my MBA, and then one day grow to become the CMO of an organization like Pepsi or IBM or one of those big global brands. And my first job out of college, by the way, in college, I graduated in honors, double majored in economics and psychology. And I was just really, really excited to join the corporate world. And first job out of college in Southern California, working for a technology company. I had a 3-hour daily commute, so 15 hours a day driving.
Okay.
And I took the job because I was promised that I would be doing all these wonderful things and traveling the country and meeting with executives and entrepreneurs. And a few months into my job, I'm doing data entry and cold calling and PowerPoint presentations. And then the key moment came when the CEO came out of his beautiful corner office and he's like, Jacob, I got a really, really important project for you. And I got very excited about it. And it turns out that all he wanted me to do was to go get him coffee because he was late for a meeting. And he's like, here's a $10 bill. Can you go to Starbucks and get me a latte and, get yourself a cup of coffee as well? That was one of the last full-time jobs I ever had working for anybody else, around 12 years ago now. And ever since then, I've just been really passionate and interested in trying to create organizations where people want to show up to work each day.
Right.
And this book, The Future Leader, came about because I would get asked questions about leadership all the time, but not about present-day leadership, but about where things are going in the future. So I decided to actually collect some data and do some research on that and see what I could find. And that's what became the book.
All right. Like the concept, and we all know the value of leadership. And right now, more than any time, leadership is just really critical, whether it's leadership in companies, corporate America, leadership in a small company, personal leadership, political leadership. Leadership's really valuable and important. I know you did a lot of research for this book. Can you share some background on the research that you did for the book?
Yeah, so there were 2 key pieces of research that were involved for the book. The first is interviewing 140 CEOs at some of the world's biggest companies. A lot of the brands are, of course, some are people familiar with. For example, Audi, Unilever, Best Buy, Oracle, SAP, KPMG. But there are a lot of other really big brands that people have probably never heard of, like NL or NG or Koch Holdings, which all have, several hundred thousands of employees. But these are like the largest companies in Italy or in Turkey or Saint-Gobain in France. So I tried to get a big international audience around this and interview, like I said, the world's top CEOs. The second part of the research that went into this book was teaming up with LinkedIn, and we surveyed almost 14,000 employees around the world. These are LinkedIn members who identified as being employed full-time.
Interesting. All right. How did you get into LinkedIn? What did it take to get in and partner with them?
Well, I've had good relationships with LinkedIn and with several of these CEOs for a while. And I've done interviews with them. I've spoken at their companies. I've advised some of these organizations over the years. LinkedIn, I just happened to have a good relationship there with some people. And I reached out to them, let them know about the project that I was doing. And they had leadership is a big priority for them.
Sure.
And same for these CEOs. A lot of people forget that, from the 140 CEOs who agreed to speak with me, I had hundreds, literally hundreds of others who said no, or their gatekeepers said no. The CEO didn't even know the request was being made.
Right.
But it was a lot of work and effort and dealing with legal teams and PR teams and assistants and rescheduling it. So it was tough.
All right. A lot of persistence. So I know you gather a lot of information through this whole process. What was the most surprising thing you learned throughout all this?
Well, there are a couple of things that I was particularly surprised by. One of the things that I learned is that most leaders around the world don't actually spend a lot of time defining what leadership and who a leader actually is. We sort of take it for granted because we all assume that everybody knows these things because we're surrounded by leadership every day.
Right.
But if you were to think about it, how would you define leadership to a 5-year-old? It's something that a lot of people don't really think about and conceptualize much. It's sort of like, you and I know leadership when we see it.
Right.
But we experience it all the time. Whether you turn on the news, whether you go to a grocery store, whether you're playing sports or watching sports, we see and experience leadership all the time. And as a result, we don't really spend enough time defining it. So that was one surprising finding for me, is that was the hardest question for CEOs to answer. Is I said, can you define leadership for me?
Right.
And I got 140 different responses from 140 CEOs. Another interesting thing that I found is that on average, most people don't actually enter leadership development programs until they're in their mid 40s or late 30s.
Right.
But they actually become leaders when they are in their 20s or early 30s. So there's a period of around 10 plus years where people are in leadership positions, but they don't have any formal leadership training to be in those positions, which I think is completely mind-boggling. That, it's sort of like taking an athlete in their prime, waiting for them to turn 45 and then say, okay, now we're going to teach you how to play basketball or teach you how to play tennis. That doesn't make any sense to me. So that was another surprising statistic for me. And probably the most surprising finding for me was by interviewing these 14,000 employees around the world, I was able to get a really good cross-sectional perspective around how well leaders and organizations are practicing the skills and mindsets that I talk about in the book. And the most interesting thing for me was that a lot of leaders think they're doing a relatively good job of practicing things like emotional intelligence, of coaching and mentoring others, of being curious. I talk about 9 skills and mindsets in the book, and leaders think they're doing a pretty good job of these things. But when I ask the people who work for these leaders, how well do you think your leaders are doing? They all say their leaders are doing a terrible job.
Right.
So the big finding from this is that leaders around the world are not prepared at all for the future, for the trends that are impacting leadership, for the challenges that they're going to have to overcome. And they're doing a terrible job of practicing the skills and mindsets that I identified.
Interesting. So let's delve in. I want to go into some of the details. Obviously, the book's about, what are the most crucial skills and mindsets. So can you step us through what are some of the most crucial skills and mindsets that the CEOs identified? What are we seeing?
Sure. So when I wrote the book, I kind of grouped these into fun little personas that I created. So for example, I have like the mindset of the explorer or the skill of Yoda, for example. So these all include things. So I'll go through some of the mindsets, for example. So some of the mindsets include things like humility and vulnerability, having a mindset of curiosity, a mindset of embracing diversity, being able to think big picture, global perspective, a mindset of being open-minded, having a growth mindset is absolutely essential. Being a lifelong learner, being service-oriented is another one. So those are some of the mindsets as far as how leaders need to think. And then some of the skills include things like being able to motivate and engage and inspire people, thinking like a futurist, which was the number one skill CEOs identified, which basically means you think in terms of scenarios and possibilities instead of just one path.
Yep.
Emotional intelligence, empathy, and self-awareness specifically were two that were called out. Being tech savvy and digitally fluent was another one. And being able to coach and create other people who are more successful than you as a leader. So those were some of the most important mindsets and skills that came out of it.
Interesting. So a lot of these are ones that I think make sense. I get it right away in terms of, you're a leader, you need to be thinking about the future, you're a motivator. I think a lot of people think in terms of a leader as a motivator. That's kind of one of the first things that people are thinking about. But what struck me also is one of the things you just said is that being self-aware was really important. Yet a lot of the people you interviewed thought they were doing a great job as a leader, and their people thought they were doing a great job. But then when you went to the people themselves who worked for them, they didn't think their bosses were doing such a great job.
No,
so they're not quite
terrible job.
A terrible job. So even though all the CEOs and leaders felt it was important to be self-aware, it sounds like a lot of them really weren't self-aware.
Yeah, that was the really interesting thing, right? Is my assumption was that if a lot of these CEOs are identifying these skills and mindsets as being so crucial, that we would have a large percentage of people around the world who say that their leaders are doing a very good job of these things. And by the way, I looked at mid-level leaders and senior level leaders. And this was consistent across the board, where leaders consistently overestimated how well they're doing with these things.
Right.
Whereas the people who work for these leaders, I think the percentage of people who scored in the very well category were single digits for mid and senior level leaders. So not many at all.
Interesting.
So, I mean, it just goes to show, it's the classic ivory tower problem, disconnected from the company, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of hierarchy. It really gets reflected.
So a lot of these things you're talking about, I know other folks might have learned about. Emotional intelligence is something that's been spoken about for many, many years since the book. Daniel Goleman wrote a book about it. So a lot of these things, being able to motivate people, even if it's just a couple of people that you have in a small organization, or not only your own people, your clients you want to motivate contractors, you want to be able to motivate. So a lot of these things I think are skills that everybody knows about, they've heard about it, and these are skills that people in general would want, independent of what level of leadership that someone might have. So for people listening, how can people get started? So these are skills, a lot of the ones that you mentioned, even things in the mindset ones, curiosity, I'm looking at some of the other ones, open-mindedness, service-oriented. How do you start developing and changing these mindsets and upskilling yourself? What do people need to do?
Yeah. And by the way, when I say leader, you don't just have to be somebody who's responsible for other people. You can be a leader of yourself as well. Sure. So even if you're an entrepreneur, an individual contributor at a large organization, these are still essential skills and mindsets for you to possess just to be able to succeed and thrive in whatever is happening in the future. Right. And what's interesting is that a lot of these skills and mindsets are, of course, relevant now, right? I mean, nobody's listening to these things going like, oh my God, I've never heard of empathy before. I've never heard of coaching and mentoring. We've heard of these things. But the problem is that we are not doing a good job of practicing these things today. And so what these CEOs told me is that over the next 10 years, by the year 2030, these are going to be essential things. In other words, you will not be able to be in a leadership position unless you practice these things.
Right.
Now, some might say, oh, that's true today. But that's not the case, because look at how many stories we keep hearing about in the media and in the news of leaders who are not self-aware. We hear about the stories like Uber, the CEO of United Airlines, when that passenger got thrown off. I mean, that CEO had very little emotional intelligence there. He had no empathy. So there are a lot of leaders and a lot of people who work for these types of leaders who get into these positions of power simply because they make them, they bring in a lot of money, they close big deals, they've stayed at the company for a long time, they're good at kind of navigating the bureaucracy and climbing the ladder. They get to those positions not necessarily because they're practicing these things, but because they know how to work the system.
Right.
And so there are a lot of leaders today who are in those positions of power who probably shouldn't be. So the argument is that while these skills and mindsets aren't necessarily new, they are going to be 180% essential if you want to be in any kind of leadership position over the coming years. So as far as where to get started, I think there are a couple of things that people can start to do. So first is to understand what the skills and mindsets are. And you mentioned the URL a few times at futureleadersurvey.com. There's an assessment that I created, which basically walks you through, and thousands of people around the world have taken this already. It walks you through these skills and mindsets and basically assesses on how well you're practicing these things. So you can take this for yourself, but if you got a little bit more courage, you can also have somebody take this on behalf of you to see how well somebody else thinks you're practicing these skills and mindsets. Mm-hmm. That's the real test of boldness there. I think the second thing that is really, really essential to do is, after you understand the skills and mindsets that I talk about, is I have what I call a 1% challenge. Mm-hmm. And the 1% challenge is, I want to encourage everybody to think of what they can do each day to be 1% better than the day before. And if you improve by 1% a day, then by the end of the year, you will be 37 times better. Okay. So 1% a day, by the end of the year, you'll be 37 times better. That's a complete transformation. And it's a radical change in a year. Yes. And 1% is small. 1% means, for example, you take 10 to 20 minutes a day and you watch a TED talk about something new to practice curiosity, right. Or you listen to a podcast or watch a video like this. 1% means that when somebody comes to you with a problem or something that they need help with, you try to practice empathy and put yourself into their shoes and get their perspective before you try to respond. 1% a day means trying to learn about a new technology that's out there. Right? I mean, I'm talking about small things here that anybody can do to improve. So that would be definitely a second place that I would start. So first, do the assessment, understand the skills and mindsets, improve by 1% a day. Another thing that I always encourage people to do is to avoid having a typical day. This is especially relevant if you work in a organization, but it's also relevant if you're an entrepreneur. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I have a team of 10 people that I work with. And when every day starts to feel the same, look the same, be the same, you trap yourself in a box where it becomes very hard to practice some of these skills and mindsets. Right. You have a routine, you have a formula, you're not challenging yourself, you don't become as engaged. Now, I'm not advocating for creating pure chaos in your life, right? But whenever possible, meet new people. You know, if you're at a company, take out a coworker for coffee that you normally don't talk to, or maybe somebody from a different team. Try to mix things up a little bit so that you're constantly learning new things. You're being aware of what's happening in the world. I think that's another great place for people to start. And maybe the last piece of advice is, don't wait for anybody to teach you these things. You can't wait for an educational institution or for a company to look out for you. You got to look out for yourself. As we see, especially now with the whole pandemic, the COVID-19, companies are going through layoffs, through furloughs, people are being fired, all sorts of madness is happening. And as much as there are some fantastic organizations out there, nobody's going to look out for you but you. And this is why it's so essential for everybody to take more accountability over their personal and professional development. Learn the things that you got to learn for your job, for your career to be successful. And there's no excuse now to not be able to do that with so many resources that we have, whether it's YouTube videos or online courses or classes. So really take your own personal and professional development into your own hands.
I like it. I just want to quickly summarize. So the first thing, and I agree with this, you want to do some sort of assessment. You want to see where you are. And I just want to give it out one more time. It's futureleadersurvey.com.
Yes.
Futureleadersurvey.com. And I love this idea, this 1% increase each day, because I like it for a couple of reasons. One is it gets you thinking on a daily basis, what can I do? So it kind of makes it top of mind all the time. And I think that the third thing you mentioned was kind of change your routine. Don't get stuck in the same routine, kind of mix it up in terms of what you do. And the fourth one I think is critical and probably something everybody knows, that if you're listening to this right now, that you have the ability to take some control over it. Yeah. And that you can proactively do that. So I think those are four really powerful approaches. And and I'm a big person in terms of my belief in being self-aware is critical. So assessment's always a great place to start.
Yep.
So I want to jump to another area. So one of the things we're seeing right now is just the use of technology. What's the impact that technology is going to have on leadership? What do you see that in the future?
So I think actually technology will make it blatantly clear who the good leaders and who the bad leaders are in organizations around the world. And the reason why I say that is because if you break down what a leader typically does, it can be grouped into two buckets. The first bucket is a leader typically makes decisions. They have more power and authority. They're higher up on the food chain, so they make decisions. And the second thing that a leader typically does is they get people to move in the direction of that decision. So if you're a good leader, you do both of those things. If you're a bad leader, though, you typically just focus on the decision making. You just typically focus on like, I have the data, I have the information, I'm going to tell you what to do, you go do it. What we're already starting to see with the influx of technology is that things like AI can make better, more accurate decisions than humans ever could. So if you believe that your job as a leader is simply to tell other people what to do and to make decisions, and if technology is starting to do that already, you can imagine where it's going to be in 10 years. In 10 years' time, a lot of the decisions that leaders make are going to be very much driven and fueled by AI and technology, which is going to guide us and maybe even tell us what we should be doing with our businesses and even our lives. So if that's all you focus on as a leader, then your value to the organization decreases dramatically because that's something that technology is going to be able to do over the next decade. But if you're a great leader who also focuses on the human aspect, engaging, empowering, inspiring, motivating others, all of a sudden your value increases tenfold. And so that's why I think the impact that technology is going to have is it's going to make us realize who are the good leaders and who are the bad leaders. And it's going to force the bad leaders to either leave or to learn how to embrace some of the human qualities that we need to have at work.
All right. It makes a lot of sense. I absolutely get it. What's interesting is just I'd never really thought of it in terms of decisions and then moving people towards decisions. I never really separated as kind of those are the two key things. But now that you're bringing my awareness, it makes total sense. And you're right. AI is going to be using technology. It's going to be used a lot more to make decisions. Statistics are used a lot more.
Yeah.
And people are seeing this all the time. So one of the things you obviously did is really evaluate how leaders are doing. So how are leaders doing today when it comes to, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but what's your overall view? Any other insight in how leaders are doing today when it comes to the kind of these skills and mindsets?
So when it comes to the skills and mindsets across the board, leaders are not doing well. According to them, they think they're doing a pretty good or decent job, but the people who work for these leaders say they're not doing a good job. And I know this sounds a little bit negative, but I also want this to be an opportunity because this is an easy fix. I mean, it requires definitely work and time, but it's not something that we can't do, right? I mean, this is something that we all have the power to change and fix inside of our organizations. And so I look at this as more of an opportunity because if we're able to fix this and if we're able to get our leaders to practice these skills and mindsets, I mean, think about the problems we'll be able to overcome, the challenges we'll be able to solve. Yeah, I mean, it'll be amazing. We'll have organizations around the world where employees genuinely want to show up to work each day. So I see dramatic impact and potential over the next 10 years if we're able to take some sort of action behind it. But today, and this is true with the skills, with the mindsets, with trends that I looked at in the book, and with challenges, leaders across the board are not ready for the trends, they're not ready for the challenges, and they're not practicing the skills and mindsets that are required to lead effectively over the next decade. So my hope is that people who are watching this, people who read the book, they'll have the tools and the resources they need to take those next steps to be able to close that gap. And really, I think, create dramatic change.
All right. I like those concepts, and I'm hopeful also that things are going to start changing, especially leadership. And we're seeing the leadership challenges all the time. So I just want to mention a couple of things. So once again, futureleadersurvey.com. Now, can you tell us a little bit about, obviously you've done your book, you do consulting. What kind of work do you do, and who should you be, people contacting? So if someone's interested in working with you, how do they approach you? What do you do and how does somebody approach you?
Sure. So I do a couple different things. The most common thing that I do is I speak at a lot of conferences and events each year. But of course, there are a lot of individuals out there. There are people who work for organizations who are not going to be bringing me in and spending thousands of dollars to have me speak. So I also create a lot of content in the form of podcasts, videos, articles. So I create a lot of free resources out there for people to check out to educate themselves, their teams, their companies. And I also have futureofworkuniversity.com, which is where I create courses. So digital courses that people can take that will teach them all of these things. But if people want to get in touch with me directly, my personal website is thefutureorganization.com. And my email is jacob@thefutureorganization.com.
Okay, easy enough. I know we covered a lot of information today. Before we wrap up, any final words that you want to finish up? Any final message that you want to share relative to everything we talked about today?
Sure. So if people can see, the cover is a lighthouse. And I chose that visual for the book on purpose because a lighthouse is supposed to guide mariners and explorers to their destination, but also to help make sure that they can get to their destination safely. And that is the visual that I would like people to have in their minds when they think of either themselves as a leader or somebody that they work with as a leader. You have to be the lighthouse, which means that not only do you need to build yourself up as the lighthouse to learn these skills and mindsets that I talk about, but you also need to guide others to safety and to success, because a lighthouse without ships in the water is useless. So if you're just teaching these things to yourself, you're helping yourself, but it's also important to make sure that you help others. And again, if you work at a company, it's helping your team members. If you are an individual contributor or an entrepreneur, it means helping your family. It means maybe helping your friends. These are skills and mindsets that everybody should be benefiting from and learning about. So treat yourself and think of yourself as the lighthouse, and your job is to guide others.
All right. I like that image. I agree with you completely. I think we all need to see ourselves as leaders because we are all leaders, regardless of where we fit into an organization, a hierarchy. We're all providing leadership. All right.
Yep.
Jacob, is very interesting. A lot of really good information. Thanks for sharing everything today. I want to thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And I want to thank everybody for listening. And I want to wish everybody great success in all areas of your life. We'll talk to everybody soon. All right. Take care.